Part 1. What the Earth Kept. The sky over Otero County had forgotten how to make rain. It had been 3 years now. 3 years of watching the grass turn from gold to brown to something that wasn't even a color anymore. Just the memory of color ground into pale dust by a sun that showed up every morning without apology. The Sacramento mountains stood on the horizon the way they always had, blue and distant and indifferent, holding whatever moisture they possessed far up in their ridges where it did nobody on the flatlands any good. Nora Hargrove stood on the front porch of the ranch house and held a mug of coffee she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. She was 52 years old, though most people who met her guessed younger not because she looked soft, but because she looked hard in a way that seemed permanent and settled rather than worn down. She was lean and straight-backed, with dark hair cut short at the sides and left a little longer on top, threaded through with silver she had stopped noticing. Her hands were a rancher's hands, the knuckles wide, the skin rough along the palms, but they were also something else, precise, deliberate, the hands of someone trained to gather evidence and read a scene before anyone else in the room had finished blinking. 15 years in the Army Criminal Investigation Division had given her that. Afghanistan had given her the other thing. The thing that woke her at 3 in the morning with the smell of smoke in her nose and the sound of a city that no longer existed ringing in her ears. The dog at her side was the only reason she had stayed in New Mexico after her husband passed. The only reason she had stayed in her own skin on the worst nights. His name was Ace. He was a German shepherd, 7 years old, with a coat that ran from deep charcoal at the spine down through shades of iron and ash to pure white at his chest and paws. He was large even for his breed, and when he stood still, which he often did, he looked less like a domestic animal and more like something carved out of a hillside elemental, unhurried ancient. He had been trained as a PTSD service dog, which was the official classification. Nora thought of him differently. She thought of him as the last honest thing in her life. He was pressed against her left leg, now his shoulder warmed through the denim of her jeans, his amber eyes scanning the empty pasture with the same patience he applied to everything. On the kitchen table behind her, visible through the screen door, lay a white envelope. It was the third one this month from Consolidated Valley Bank. The name on the return address was Sandra Pruitt, Senior Loan Officer. Nora had not opened it. She didn't need to. She knew the language of foreclosure proceedings the way she knew the language of an autopsy report. Formal, precise, and absolutely without mercy. The Hargrove Ranch had been in the family for 3 generations. Her mother had worked it alone after Frank died. Nora had taken it over after the Army. At its peak, it had run 200 head of cattle on 800 acres of high desert grassland. Now the cattle pens were empty except for 60 animals she was barely keeping alive on purchased feed, and the grassland was a cracked brown canvas that crunched underfoot like old paper. She needed water. Not the water that came in a tank on a truck at $400 a load. She needed a source, something permanent, something underground. Her eyes moved to the north pasture. It was the part of the property she had avoided her whole life, the way you avoid looking directly at something that makes you uneasy without being able to say exactly why. At its center, rising from the flat scrubland like a mistake, stood the mound. It had no proper name on any modern map. The locals called it the Petrified Mound, or sometimes just the Old Mound, or sometimes nothing at all, because talking about it felt like drawing attention to something that preferred to be ignored. It was massive, taller than the ranch house, wider at the base than the barn, a dense formation of reddish-gray fossilized clay and compacted mineral that had hardened over centuries into something closer to stone than earth. Old Spanish surveys marked it as a landmark. The Mescalero Apache, according to Helen Marsh at the county library, had traditionally avoided the area entirely. Her neighbor Earl Briggs said his grandfather had tried to blast it in 1957 and had only succeeded in breaking 3 drill bits and straining his back. Nora believed in geology, not superstition. And what geology told her was this: a structure that size, that permanent, that resistant to erosion, could only have formed and survived above a deep, stable substrate. Something that didn't shift. Something that was fed by a consistent source, far underground water, moving through fractured limestone from the mountains, slow and cold and reliable, untouched by 3 years of surface drought. It was her last option. It was as best she could calculate on the back of Sandra Pruitt's second letter, possibly worth enough as a water rights asset to restructure the loans and keep the bank from taking everything her mother had bled 30 years to hold on to. She would move the mound, or at least enough of it, to get a drill rig down to what she believed was underneath. Earl Briggs had stopped by 2 days ago, leaning against her fence post, with his hat brimmed low and his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who has seen enough bad ideas to recognize them on sight. "You're wasting your time, Nora," he said. "That thing doesn't move. My grandfather tried. Your grandfather tried. The ground around it's been dead since anyone can remember. You'll break your equipment before you make a dent." "I appreciate the history, Earl. History is all I'm offering. The rest is your business." He had driven away in his truck, leaving a thin plume of dust that dissolved in the dry air within seconds. Nora had gone to bed that night and lain in the dark, listening to Ace breathe on the floor beside her. In the morning, she had checked the fuel level on the old bulldozer, the yellow Caterpillar her mother had purchased secondhand in 1989, and she had decided. The sun was already brutal at 7:30 when she walked the bulldozer out of the equipment barn and turned it north. Ace followed at a distance, which was unusual. Normally, he stayed close within 10 feet on a working day within arm's reach when something was wrong. Today, he kept back 20 yards, his ears pivoting, his body language carrying something she recognized as reluctance without quite being able to name. She noticed, she always noticed, but she put it aside. The mound was worse up close than from a distance. Up close, you felt the wrongness of it in a way that was difficult to rationalize. The earth immediately surrounding it was barren in a manner that went beyond drought. Plants didn't just die near it, they seemed to have decided long ago not to attempt growing in the first place. The soil was the color of old concrete, dense and pale, compacted into a surface that resisted the toe of her boot when she tested it. The mound itself rose about 18 feet at its peak, sloping on all sides in a way that suggested gradual accumulation rather than geological uplift. Up close, the surface showed streaks of mineral deposit iron, red sulfur yellow, dull metallic gray, layered through the gray-brown clay like sediment in canyon walls. She lowered the blade and engaged the tracks. The sound was immediate and unpleasant. A high metallic shriek, the kind that gets into your back teeth as the hardened steel edge met the surface of the mound and found nothing to push. The tracks spun, kicking up twin arcs of dust. The engine roared and the frame shuddered, and the mound sat there exactly as it had sat for a century, unmoved and unimpressed. She backed up, throttled harder, drove forward again. The impact this time sent a jolt up through the seat and into her spine that she felt in her molars. A handful of chips pale as bone scattered from the impact point. The mound was otherwise unchanged. She was lining up for a third run when Ace began to bark. It was not his alert bark, the two sharp notes he used for coyotes, or the distant sound of an unfamiliar engine on the road. It was not his warning bark either, the deep, sustained sound that meant something large and close. This was something she had heard from him only twice before in their 7 years together, both times in moments of genuine emergency. This was his alarm. Rapid, high, and desperate, overlapping itself, the vocal equivalent of a shout. She pulled the throttle back and the engine dropped to idle. Ace was not at the mound. He had moved 40 feet to the left of where she was working, and he was operating in a state of concentrated frenzy she had never seen him display. He was running tight circles around one specific patch of ground. Then he would stop bark at the earth itself and dig his front paws, moving in rapid, powerful strokes that threw loose dirt in arcs behind him. Then he would stop digging and look back at her with an expression she could only describe as frantic urgency. Then back to digging. "Ace, heel," she called. He did not heel. She sat for a moment, watching him, her hand still on the throttle. In 15 years of investigating crime scenes, she had learned to pay attention to anomalies. A detail that didn't fit the pattern was not a detail to dismiss. It was the detail. It was the thing you organized everything else around. Ace was an anomaly. She shut the engine off. The silence of the high desert rolled in immediately, vast and clean, broken only by the rapid scrape of the dog's claws and the sharp percussion of his barking. She climbed down from the bottom, took the short-handled shovel from the bracket on the side of the machine and walked toward him. "Show me," she said. He dug harder. The ground here was the same gray-white hardpack as everywhere near the mound, almost ceramic in its density. She drove the shovel in with her boot and found the resistance of it through the handle like trying to dig through old concrete. She worked steadily, methodically, the way she had learned to work at crime scenes where the physical evidence was patient and could outlast any amount of urgency. 3 minutes in the shovel struck something that was not stone. The vibration that came up through the handle was hollow, resonant, a deep, flat clang that had no business coming from the ground beneath a New Mexico cattle ranch. She stopped. She crouched and scraped the shovel tip laterally across the buried surface, clearing dirt rather than driving deeper. The grating sound of metal on metal was immediate and unmistakable. She sat back on her heels. Ace had stopped digging. He was watching her now with the particular focused attention he gave to moments that required her full presence. She began clearing with her hands, pulling away chunks of compacted gray earth, scraping the surface clean. It took another 15 minutes, Ace helping beside her, his paws moving in the same rhythm as her hands before the object was fully exposed. It was a hatch, a square of heavy steel 4 feet to a side set flush into the earth with a precision that had nothing to do with farming or ranching or any civilian purpose she could name. The metal was thick, more than an inch she estimated, and covered in oxidized rust the color of dried blood. Heavy rivets, the old-fashioned kind, with domed heads, studded the perimeter in regular intervals. In the center sat a recessed ring-pull handle, thick as her wrist, designed to be gripped with both hands. She was still crouching, her heart performing a slow, hard rhythm against her sternum when she began to clean the surface. Her gloved fingers working at the caked-on grime, the decades of sun-baked soil pressed into every crevice and seam. A shape emerged first, then color beneath the rust, a pale, faded blue. She knew what she was seeing before she finished clearing it. The winged star of the United States Air Force, faded to almost nothing but unmistakable to anyone who had spent time on military installations. Below the insignia, stenciled letters in the blocky military-issue font she had seen on equipment crates and file folders and classified documents throughout her career, Project Nightfall. Below that, 1968. She sat completely still. The high desert around her was silent. The bulldozer ticked as its engine cooled. The sun pressed down without mercy. 1968. She had not been born until 1972. Her father had died in 1973 when she was less than a year old. She had no memory of him, not his voice, not his face in motion, not the weight of his hand or the smell of his jacket. She knew him from a single photograph on her mother's dresser, a lean man in his early 30s. Dark hair standing in front of a building she had never identified, squinting into the sun with an expression that might have been pride or might have been worry, and in a black and white photograph was impossible to distinguish between the two. She knew his name. She knew his work. He had been an engineer at Holloman Air Force Base 20 miles over the ridge. Her mother had said he was meticulous, careful, the kind of man who checked his work twice and then checked it again. She had said he worried too much and laughed too rarely and made the best coffee she had ever tasted in her life. He had died of a heart attack in November of 1973 at the age of 37. Now she leaned forward and cleared the last of the grime from the area below the project designation, where a secondary stencil identified the construction team. Partially obscured, partially legible, were a series of initials corresponding to personnel designations she recognized from military engineering documentation. Lead engineer, safety officer, site supervisor. Next to safety officer, in slightly different ink than the others, as if added separately or at a different time, F.H. Frank Hargrove. Nora did not move for a long moment. The sun was on her back and the earth was hard beneath her knees, and somewhere behind her, the bulldozer was cooling in the heat. Ace pressed his full weight against her side. She put her hand on his head without looking at him. She went back to the equipment barn for tools. She returned with a pry bar, a sledgehammer, a high-powered flashlight, and the long climbing rope she used for working on the old windmill. She tied the rope to the bulldozer's blade, the most solid anchor on the property, and laid the rest of her tools at the edge of the cleared ground. The locking mechanism was a recessed wheel, the kind she had seen on submarine hatches in photographs designed to compress a rubber seal against the frame. It had not been turned in more than half a century. The rust was not surface rust, it was structural, the metal of the wheel fused to the mechanism beneath by decades of oxidation and subterranean chemistry. She wedged the pry bar into one of the wheel's spokes and leaned her weight against it. Nothing moved. She reset the bar and picked up the sledgehammer. The sound of steel on steel in the open desert was sharp and solitary, each blow ringing out flat and clean before the silence swallowed it. She struck the bar 3 times, reset, struck again. On the 5th sequence, something in the mechanism gave a sound like a bone snapping under pressure, a dense structural crack, and the wheel moved a 1/4 inch, then half an inch. Then with a sustained groan of metal that had been still too long, it began to turn. What happened next was not dramatic in the way of movies or stories. It was simply physics, the equalization of pressure between a sealed, subterranean space and the dry, New Mexico air above it. The rubber gasket around the hatch perimeter, brittle after 60 years of compression, cracked and released, and air moved. The sound it made was a sustained hiss, soft and steady, like something exhaling after a very long time. What followed the sound was the smell. Ace reacted before she had processed it consciously. The dog lurched backward 3 full steps, his claws scoring the hard pack, and then he was barking, and not the alarm bark from before, but something raw, a sound that came from a more primitive place, the instinct of an animal registering something its biology recognized as wrong. He would not come closer. He circled at a distance, his bark shifting between alarm and distress. Nora brought her arm up over her nose and mouth. The smell was not the smell of death or decay. It was chemical and dry and deeply metallic, with an undertone of ozone and a secondary note she couldn't name, but that made the back of her throat feel coated. It was the smell of a machine that had been sealed, and forgotten lubricants turned rancid electrical components, oxidizing in the dark materials, off-gassing into a closed space over decades. "Easy," she told Ace. "Stay." She gripped the ring pull handle with both hands and pulled. The hatch moved with surprising resistance, the steel edge scraping across the compacted soil with a sound she felt as much as heard, a vibration in her chest. It swung up and over and settled on the ground to the left, and the square of darkness beneath it was absolute, a hole in the world, perfectly black, opening into something that had no relationship to the sun-bright day around it. A steel ladder was bolted to the near wall, disappearing downward. The rungs were dark with rust and slick with a thin film she didn't want to think about. She looked at Ace. He had stopped barking. He was sitting at his maximum comfortable distance from the hatch, his body rigid, his expression carrying the specific quality she had come to recognize over 7 years. "As I don't like this. I am telling you I don't like this. I will stay because you asked me to, but I am registering my objection clearly." "Watch the perimeter," she told him. "I'll be right back up." She clipped the flashlight to her belt, tested the knot on the rope, and swung her legs over the edge. Her boots found the first rung. Cold. Slick. The smell intensified as she descended. 10 feet down, 15. The light of the surface diminished above her, and she was in a different environment, cooler by at least 20 degrees. The air thick with the chemical smell, the darkness close in a way that was tactile rather than merely visual. Her boots hit a solid metal plate floor. She unclipped the flashlight and turned it on. The beam cut through the dark in a sharp white cone, and she stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting the space define itself. She was in a square room, roughly 10 feet on each side. The walls were riveted steel panels, the paint once gray, she thought, flaking away in large sheets to reveal the red-brown of heavy oxidation beneath. Pipes ran along the ceiling, bundled with thick cable wrapped in insulation that had cracked and crumbled. An electrical panel on one wall was frozen in whatever state it had been left in, breakers thrown, indicator, lights long dead. In the corner, on a metal shelf bolted to the wall, she found what she was looking for. Or rather, she found more than she was looking for. The first item was a book, a ledger bound in dark leather that had warped and stiffened with moisture, the cover furred with gray-green mold. Technical documentation of some kind, the pages thick and high quality, the kind used for official records. The second item was a device on the shelf beside it, boxy yellow, with a handle and an analog meter face. She recognized it immediately. A Geiger counter, the old-fashioned civil defense model from the 1960s, the kind issued to military installations and emergency management facilities during the Cold War. She picked it up. The needle moved. Not much. The scale was logarithmic, and the reading was in a range that would not produce immediate physiological effects. But the needle was not at 0. It was not registering background radiation, the natural ambient level that exists everywhere on Earth. It was above that, meaningfully above it, and it was not moving towards 0. It was steady, patient, persistent. This was not residual contamination from equipment stored in the room. The reading was too consistent for that. It was coming from below, from the earth itself, from the ground 60 years of Hargrove family had lived on and planted on and drawn water from. She stood very still with the Geiger counter in her hands and let that understanding settle into her, the way cold settles into old bone, slowly, completely, with permanence. The third item was a small metal box, gray-painted steel with a military-style latch, the kind used for ammunition or sensitive documents. She opened it. Inside, nested in deteriorated foam padding, were 3 reels of audio tape in plastic cases. The cases were stamped with the same blocky stencil font as the Hatch Project Nightfall, and 3 dates, all from 1968. She was placing the items carefully into her jacket when she made the mistake of looking at the far wall. There was a tunnel. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, and it opened into darkness that the flashlight beam couldn't reach the end of. The walls were the same riveted steel as the room, and the air moving from it was colder and wetter than what was in the room. She had been managing fine until the tunnel. It wasn't the tunnel itself. It was the combination, the confined space, the darkness in front of her, the cold air moving against her face, and something in the chemistry of the underground smell that her nervous system had filed away under a category she spent years trying to empty out. She was not in New Mexico anymore. She was in Kandahar, 2009, following a source through a basement corridor that turned out not to be a basement corridor at all. She was listening to her own heartbeat accelerate. She was feeling the weight of the structure above her, pressing down in a way that was physical and absolute. Her chest locked. The flashlight beam trembled. The walls of the room moved slightly inward, and she knew with the specific knowledge of a system in full panic response that they hadn't moved at all, and it didn't matter. Then Ace's claws on the metal hatch above her. Rapid, frantic scraping, the sound of a dog trying to reach his person by any means available. And beneath it, barely audible, a high, thin whine that she recognized as his most acute distress signal, not alarm, not warning, but grief adjacent, the sound he made when he knew she was in pain and couldn't get to her. The sound traveled down through the metal and the dark and hit her somewhere below the panic. She was in New Mexico. She was below her own land. Ace was 12 feet above her, and she needed to go back up. She gathered the ledger, the Geiger counter, and the box of tapes. She climbed. The sun, when she came back into it, was the most welcome thing she had felt in years. She collapsed onto the hard pack beside the hatch and put her back to the warm earth and breathed slow and deliberate, the technique she had learned in a VA group session she had attended exactly twice before deciding she preferred to manage alone. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The sky above her was the specific deep blue of high desert at midday, cloudless and absolute. Ace was on her before she had finished the first breath. Not barking, not circling, just present, his body lowering itself alongside hers, his head pushing under her arm, his warm weight settling against her ribs. She felt his heartbeat, elevated, coming down. She held him. When her hands had stopped shaking, she sat up and looked at the 3 items she had pulled from the dark, laid out on the hard pack in the sun like evidence at a scene. The warped leather ledger, the Geiger counter with its needle sitting above 0, the metal box with 3 reels of her father's voice. She did not open any of them. She covered the hatch carefully, pushing the excess dirt back over the disturbed area with her boot, then moving the bulldozer forward until its blade rested across the cleared patch. Not hiding it, but making it look like equipment storage rather than an excavation site. She worked efficiently and without hurry, with the systematic attention to evidence preservation she had spent 15 years practicing. Then she loaded the items into the truck, put Ace in the passenger seat, and drove back to the house. The sun was beginning its afternoon descent, pulling long shadows from the fence posts and the equipment barn, stretching them east across the dead grass. The ranch looked the same as it had that morning. The empty cattle pens, the dry water trough, the leaning windmill, the warped porch boards. Sandra Pruitt's envelope was still on the kitchen table. Nora set the ledger in the metal box beside it. She placed the Geiger counter on the kitchen counter near the window. Its needle held steady above 0, ticking at irregular intervals, soft, quiet, patient. She stood at the counter for a long moment, her hand flat on the surface, looking at the counter's needle. Then she filled Ace's water bowl, changed out of her work clothes, and sat down at the kitchen table with the ledger in front of her. She did not open it yet. She was still a CID officer in the part of her that mattered for this. She was still the woman who had learned through repetition and consequence that you gathered all the evidence you could before you started drawing conclusions. Because conclusions were easy and wrong. Conclusions were permanent. She would open the ledger. She would play the tapes. She would follow whatever this led to with the same methodical patience she had applied to every investigation that had mattered. But she sat for a moment first in the cooling afternoon kitchen with Ace pressed against her legs and the Geiger counter ticking on the windowsill and 3 reels of her dead father's voice in a box on the table in front of her. And she let herself feel the full strange weight of the day before any of it became something she had to act on. Outside, the sun was going down behind the Sacramentos. The ranch was quiet, and somewhere under the north pasture an instrument that had been sleeping for 60 years had finished waking up. Part 2, Voice in the Dark. The Akai reel-to-reel player was in the back of her father's workshop. Nora had known it was there her entire life without ever having a reason to think about it. It sat under a canvas drop cloth on the workbench her mother had never touched after 1973, alongside a row of capacitors and resistors and coils of copper wire, and the other artifacts of a man who had spent his evenings soldering small things together in a lean-to shed and attached to the barn. She had inherited the workshop the way she had inherited everything else about Frank Hargrove, as an absence shaped like a person, a negative space defined by what wasn't there rather than what was. She pulled the drop cloth off and stood for a moment looking at the machine. It was heavier than she remembered from childhood, when she had occasionally peeked through the workshop door and seen it sitting on the bench like a piece of serious furniture. Black and silver with 2 large reel plates and a row of controls along the front faced the transport mechanism, precise and mechanical in a way that modern electronics had lost entirely. Her mother had kept it clean. Someone had kept it clean. The heads were free of the oxidation she would have expected, and the rubber pinch roller, when she pressed it with her thumb, gave slightly rather than crumbling. She carried it to the kitchen table. It took her 20 minutes to thread the first tape correctly, referencing a fold-out instruction card she found tucked into the machine's carrying case. Her hands were steady. She had learned a long time ago how to make her hands steady when her chest was doing something else entirely. Ace lay by the back door, his head on his paws, watching her. She pressed play. The reels began to turn. A low electric hiss filled the kitchen, the sound of magnetic particles on old tape moving past a playback. Had the sound of time as a physical medium. Then a click. Then silence for 3 full seconds that felt much longer. Then her father's voice. It was the most disorienting experience of her adult life, and she had experienced things that by any objective measure ranked considerably higher on a scale of disorientation. But nothing had prepared her for this, the specific quality of a voice she had never heard coming from a man whose face she knew only from one black and white photograph speaking to her from 1968 across a gap of more than half a century, as if the distance were nothing at all. He sounded younger than she had imagined, calm in the way that engineers were often calm, systematic, precise, the words chosen for accuracy rather than effect. But underneath the professional register, there was something else, something she recognized from years of interviewing people who knew they were in trouble and were trying not to show it. This is a private log, supplemental to the official record. October 3rd, 1968. My name is Frank Hargrove, Safety Engineer, Project Nightfall, Site B. I'm recording these notes off-site as a precaution in the event that the official documentation is altered, which I have reason to believe it already has been. She sat very still. Project Nightfall is not what we represented to the Congressional Oversight Committee. It is not a geological survey program. It is a seismic weapon. The objective is to generate controlled, low-yield subterranean fractures at depth tremors precise enough in their vectors to destabilize specific enemy infrastructure from a continental distance. Dams, rail lines, underground command facilities. We were told the program was theoretical. We were told we were years from operational testing. That was not accurate. A pause. The sound of a man breathing. The faint sound of a cup being set on a hard surface. The July tests were not a success. I want to be precise about that in a way that the official record is not being precise. The July tests were a catastrophe that has been classified as a controlled outcome. What actually happened is this. Test 4 Bravo achieved fracture propagation at depth, but the fracture vector deviated from the modeled projection by a factor that our instruments were not calibrated to capture in real time. We hit the auto fault line. We were not supposed to be within 3 kilometers of the auto fault. We were directly on it. Nora was aware that she had stopped breathing normally. She corrected this. The resulting fracture intersected the lower auto basin aquifer. I confirmed this through sensor array 7, which I personally installed and which I calibrated myself. The contamination signature is strontium-90, reactor-derived, consistent with the isotopic ratios from our own program materials. The aquifer shows persistent low-level contamination across a monitored spread of roughly 12 square kilometers centered on Site B. It is not an acute event. It will not kill anyone immediately, but it is permanent, it is in the water table, and it will be there for decades. She thought about the Geiger counter on her windowsill. Its needle sitting above zero, steady and patient, in the kitchen of the house where her mother had made coffee every morning for 30 years. I reported this to the project director. I provided the sensor data, the contamination readings, and my written assessment recommending immediate cessation of all further testing and full disclosure to the relevant regulatory authorities. I was told to recalibrate my sensors. I was told the readings were instrument error. I was told that my assessment reflected a fatigue-related misinterpretation of ambiguous data and that I should take a week of administrative leave before returning to duty. The voice was still controlled, but the control was costing something now. She could hear the cost of it in the pauses, in the way certain words landed slightly harder than they needed to. I did not recalibrate my sensors. I made copies of the data and I stored them off-site. The following week, I was formally relieved of my duties at Site B. The project was officially classified as terminated due to geological instability. The site was sealed. The contamination data was not disclosed. The official record shows nothing that happened in July 1968. The aquifer contamination does not exist in any document I am aware of. A longer pause this time. I have been informed through indirect channels that a containment team from Washington has been assigned to manage what they are calling legacy liabilities from the program. I don't entirely know what that means. I think I partly know what that means. The voice changed. The register dropped slightly, and the careful professional cadence gave way to something simpler and more direct, the language of a man speaking past every intermediary to something that didn't require formal construction. If something happens to me, something sudden, something that doesn't fit the timeline of my health, it was not an accident. I want that said clearly on a recording that exists outside the official record, in a voice that can be confirmed as mine. I have a daughter. She was born in March. Her name is Nora. Something moved in Nora's chest that she did not have a precise name for. I am sorry that I am saying this into a machine instead of being there to tell her myself. I am sorry for a great many things that are not yet decided and may never need to be. But if they are decided the way I am afraid they might be, then I want her to know that her father was not careless. He was not unstable. He saw what was there, and he said what he saw, and he did not recalibrate his sensors. A final pause. I love you, Nora. Be a good person. That's all I ever wanted. The tape ran on in silence for several seconds before she reached over and stopped it. The kitchen was very quiet. The Geiger counter ticked once on the windowsill. Ace had gotten up without her noticing. He was beside her now, his head resting on her thigh, his amber eyes looking up at her with an expression that had no human equivalent and didn't need one. She sat with her hand on his head for a long time. Helen Marsh lived on a quiet street in Alamogordo, lined with old cottonwoods, whose roots had cracked and lifted the sidewalk into a continuous series of small upheavals. The house was a neat bungalow painted white with blue trim, with a front garden of drought-resistant plantings, creosote and desert willow, and a row of potted agaves along the porch rail, tended with the careful attention of someone who had spent 40 years organizing other people's information and applied the same instinct to her own small patch of the world. Helen Marsh had been the head librarian of Otero County for 38 years. She was in her late 70s now, small and deliberate in her movements, with thick frame glasses that magnified her eyes into something that gave the impression she was always looking at you more carefully than was entirely comfortable. She had known the Hargrove family Nora's entire life. She had read to Nora from picture books when she was 4 years old and had quietly ordered a shelf of grief resources for the library when Nora's husband died 6 years ago, never mentioning it directly. She opened the door before Nora reached the porch. I saw your truck, she said. Come in. Ace, your bowl is where it always is. Ace found his water bowl in the kitchen with the efficiency of a dog who has been to a place before and files locations permanently. Nora sat in the front room among the bookshelves in the stacked reading journals and accepted the cup of tea Helen pressed into her hands. I found something on the property, Nora said. I'm going to ask you about a name. I need you to tell me whatever you know honestly without managing what you think I can handle. Helen settled into the chair across from her. I've never managed what you can handle. Project Nightfall. The change was immediate and complete. Helen's cup stopped halfway to her lips. The expression on her face was not surprise. It was the expression of a woman who had kept a thing in a particular drawer for a very long time and was watching someone reach for the handle. She set the cup down carefully. Where did you find that name? Under the north pasture, on a hatch, below Holloman Air Force Base designation markings, with my father's initials on the safety engineer classification. Helen looked at her for a long moment over the tops of her glasses. Then she looked at Ace, who had come back from the kitchen and was sitting beside Nora's chair in the attentive posture he adopted when he judged a situation to require his proximity. Your mother never told you, Helen said. It was not a question. My mother told me he worked at Holloman on classified programs and died of a heart attack in 1973. That was the complete account. Your mother, Helen said quietly, was protecting you, the way she protected everything she loved by making it smaller than it was until it fit somewhere safe. She folded her hands in her lap. What do you want to know? Everything you know. Helen was quiet for a moment, assembling something. Not the words themselves, those were clearly already there, but the order and the weight of them. This was 1968, and she began. Cold War. They were testing everything they could think of at White Sands, at Holloman, things that never made the papers and never will. Most of it was legitimate research. Some of it was the kind of thing that happens when people are frightened and have unlimited money and believe the other side is doing the same thing, only faster. She paused. Project Nightfall was in that second category. The seismic weapon. Helen did not react to Nora knowing this. She simply continued. There were rumors. Nothing that ever reached print. The county paper wasn't going to run a story critical of the base, not then, not in that climate. But people talked. There was a tremor in the summer of 1968. Not large, but wrong. The wrong shape, the wrong duration. Nothing like the natural seismic activity along the Sacramento range that people were familiar with. And then there were the ambulances. Ambulances. Several. Going on to the base over the course of 2 nights in late July, not coming back out the way they would for a routine medical transfer. And then nothing. Silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence that in a small community near a military installation means something has happened that will not be discussed. Nora thought of the ledger entries. Sub-level 3 SILD. Site lockdown ordered. This is over. This is done. Your father, Helen said, and her voice changed slightly, a gentleness entering it that hadn't been there before. He used to come into the library. Before the program ended, he was reading geology journals, seismic mechanics, hydrogeology. He had that quality that careful people have of not quite being able to hide what they're worried about. She looked at her hands. I saw him in town about 2 weeks before it all stopped. He looked thin. He looked like a man who had stopped sleeping. He told you something. He told me he was concerned about structural integrity. Those were his exact words. He said it like a man who meant something much larger than the words and trusted me to understand that, which I did. Nora had been managing her breathing, her posture, the neutral expression of a trained investigator receiving information. She was managing all of it successfully. She said carefully, he died in November of 1973. Yes, of a heart attack. Helen looked at her directly without evasion, the way people who have been sitting with a difficult truth for a long time eventually do. He was 37 years old. He had passed a full physical examination at the base medical facility 3 days before he died. The examining physician noted in writing that he had the cardiovascular health of a man 10 years younger. A pause. I know this because the physician was married to a woman in my book club, and she told me privately what her husband had said, and she told me because she was troubled by it. By the time Helen chose the word precisely, the tidiness of it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a cottonwood branch moved against the window in a small wind. They killed him, Nora said. The words came out flat and clean, the way true things do when you finally say them after a long time of not saying them. Helen did not look away. The older families in this county, the ones who were here then, most of us have always thought something like that. We had no proof. We had no mechanism to pursue it, even if we had. And the man was gone, and your mother was alone with an infant, and life in a small community continues whether you've resolved your questions or not. Nora stood. Her legs were steady. She was surprised to find them steady. You should be careful, Helen said, also rising. This is not a thing from the past. A thing from the past stays in the past. Whatever you found out there, she gestured in the general direction of the Hargrove Ranch. Someone buried it deliberately. People who bury things deliberately have reasons that don't expire. Nora was at the door. Ace was already beside her, his body oriented toward the exit with the readiness of an animal that had tracked the trajectory of the conversation even without understanding the words. One more thing, Helen said. My nephew Danny, he's young, about 30, runs the investigative desk at the Journal up in Albuquerque. He's stubborn and fast, and he doesn't care about making enemies. If you ever needed someone with a platform and the sense not to flinch, that's the person. She paused. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just mentioning. Nora nodded. She stepped out into the bright afternoon. She was at the truck, her hand on the door handle, when she checked her mirrors, from habit, the 12-year practice of someone who had spent her career in environments where situational awareness was not a preference but a requirement. 2 blocks down the street, parked in the deep shade of a cottonwood, old enough to swallow a sedan in its shadow, was a black SUV. Clean, not a mark on it. The paint reflected what light reached it under the tree with a gloss that had no place in a county where every vehicle acquired a permanent coating of pale dust within 24 hours of washing. She could not see the occupants clearly. She could see the vehicle was occupied. She got in the truck. She pulled away from the curb at a normal speed, watching the mirror. The SUV did not follow immediately. It did not need to. They already knew where she lived. They had been watching Helen's house. They had seen the whole conversation. She called Danny Marsh from the ranch using the landline, which felt paranoid, and probably was, and also felt correct. He answered on the second ring with the clipped efficiency of someone who spent his working life at a desk measuring time in column inches in editorial deadlines. She gave him 30 seconds of context, his aunt's name and her own, and then she said, I need you to listen to something. I'm going to hold the phone next to a tape player. Don't ask questions until it's done. She played the last 2 minutes of the first tape. Frank's voice moved through the kitchen and into the phone line, and presumably into Danny Marsh's office in Albuquerque, where she imagined him sitting very still with whatever he had been doing before her call forgotten entirely. When the tape ended, she picked up the phone. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Mrs. Hargrove? His voice was different. The professional briskness was gone, replaced by a careful deliberateness that she recognized as the register of someone who has just undergone a significant recalibration. Don't tell me your address over the phone. I know where the Hargrove property is. My aunt has mentioned it. I'm leaving in 10 minutes. I'll be there by midnight. Do not talk to anyone else before I arrive. I'll have Ace evaluate you at the door, she said. That's fine. Yes, that's completely fine. He arrived at 11:40 driving a dusty 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked rear bumper and a press credential hanging from the rearview mirror. Ace met him at the truck door with a thorough olfactory assessment that Danny submitted to with the stillness of someone who understood the protocol. After 90 seconds, Ace moved back 1 step and his tail gave a single slow swing, not enthusiasm but clearance. Danny Marsh was young in the way that talented people sometimes look young, past the age when they should lean, and slightly rumpled, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of eyes behind his glasses that processed everything quickly and filed it and moved on. He carried a laptop bag and a small digital recorder and a set of nitrile gloves that he pulled out at the kitchen table without being asked, which told Nora a considerable amount about how seriously he was taking this. He examined the ledger page by page. He held the Geiger counter. He read the project designation on the tape cases. This is federal, he said quietly, not for the first time. This is 60 years of Tom. I know what it is, Nora said. I need you to understand what your role is. You're here to digitize and transmit the evidence. You're the mechanism, not the story. When this moves, it moves through you on your platform with your editorial oversight. But the decisions about what, when, and how, those are mine. He looked at her over the rims of his glasses. He was clearly a person accustomed to being the one who set terms. He was clearly also a person capable of recognizing when that was not the current situation. Understood, he said. They were working, Danny scanning the ledger pages into his laptop, while Nora recorded the tapes onto his digital recorder at the highest quality setting when Ace stood up. Not the slow rise of a dog changing positions. The instantaneous elevation of an animal that has received a signal. His head turned toward the back of the house, not the front where the road was, where a normal threat would come from. The back. And then Nora smelled it. Sharp, acrid, the particular chemical top note of burning synthetic material. The roofing felt on the equipment barn, the treated wood of the stall panels, the rubber of the tractor tires. She was at the living room window in 3 steps. The west side of the barn was lit from within, orange light, pushing through the gaps in the siding, and as she watched, a tongue of flame found the roof line and came through it. Every ranching instinct she possessed fired simultaneously. The hay, the equipment, the remaining feed. Everything that stood between 60 head of cattle and a catastrophic loss was in that building. "Stay here," she said to Danny. "Lock the door." She grabbed the fire extinguisher from the kitchen wall mount, a completely inadequate instrument against what was already outside. She knew this, but the body moved toward action before the mind finished the cost-benefit calculation and went through the front door at a run. She was 30 yards from the house when the back door came in. She heard it, the splintering impact of a boot against a door frame engineered for weather, not forced entry, even over the roar of the fire. The sound was wrong in a way that stopped her mid-stride. Then Danny shouted, and the shout cut off. She turned back. What happened next took less than 8 seconds, and she was not present for most of it. Ace had not followed her out the front. Ace had remained at his post the way he remained at every post she assigned him, and when the back door came apart and the man came through it, Ace did the thing he had been trained to do with the full commitment of an animal that makes no distinction between training and reality. She came through the front door in time to see the kitchen. Danny was against the far wall, his face white. A man in dark clothing and a ski mask was in the center of the room, and Ace had his forearm. Not his sleeve, his forearm. The man was large and controlled, or had been controlled before 90 pounds of German Shepherd applied itself to his dominant limb, with the mechanical commitment of a trap that has no reason to release. He was trying to get his free hand to his jacket. He was making sounds that Nora associated with a threshold of pain that overrides tactical thinking. She crossed the room. She was not a large woman, but she had 15 years of CID fieldwork and 2 combat deployments in a bone-deep economy of movement that meant she did not waste any of what she applied. She put the man's free arm in a joint lock and drove his shoulder into the cabinet door above the counter, and the sound he made suggested that Ace and she had together arrived at a comprehensive result. And then the world outside became the sun. The shock wave came first, a pressure change she felt in her sinuses and her eardrums before the sound arrived, and then the sound, a detonation of physical impact that rattled every glass in the house and blew the kitchen window inward in a cascade of small fragments. The heat followed the sound in a rolling wash of temperature that was wrong indoors, intimate and overwhelming. The diesel tank. She knew it in the same instant she felt it. The 50-gallon drum she kept by the equipment barn, the one that had been full 3 days ago. And with the heat came Kandahar. It was not a decision. It was not a failure of will or training or preparation. It was the specific neurological mechanism that 7 years of therapy had reduced but not eliminated, the involuntary routing of sensory input through a filing system that cross-referenced heat and concussion and the smell of burning fuel, and arrived at a conclusion that was wrong about geography and year and completely accurate about every physical parameter of the moment. 1.5 seconds. She knew later that it was 1.5 seconds. It felt like a much larger unit of time from the inside. Ace's shoulder hit her hip with the force of a being who has made a decision about what the situation requires. Not a nudge, not a lean. A deliberate collision at Pace's full weight driving into her at the precise point that broke the locked posture of a body frozen in a memory. She felt the impact, felt the floor under her boots, felt the cool cabinet surface under her hand, and the kitchen was the kitchen again. The man was gone. The back door was open. Through it, she could hear an engine, the SUV, already moving and already too far. She did not pursue. She stood in the kitchen with Ace pressed against her leg, and Danny staring at her from the far wall, and the window gone and the smell of burning diesel in every breath, and she looked at the floor. In the center of the kitchen, in a small dark pool that had spread from the spot where the struggle had ended, was a laminated card. Rectangular standard size, the kind worn on a lanyard. It had torn free during the fight. She could see the broken lanyard clip attached to it. She crouched and picked it up without touching the face. The card had a magnetic stripe in a photo ID window. The photo showed the man who had just been in her kitchen without the mask in what appeared to be a corporate security setting. Below the photo, in clean sans serif type, Leland Cruz. And below that, in a secondary line, Meridian Group. And in smaller text beneath that, Defense Logistics Contractor. She turned the card over in her gloved hand. Behind her, Danny let out a long, unsteady breath. "Are you, boss? I'm fine. Ace. Check in." Danny crouched beside the dog, with his hands moving carefully over the shepherd's coat, checking for cuts or punctures the way she had shown him, and Ace submitted to the examination with the patience of an animal who understands that this is care being offered rather than intrusion being performed. "He's not hurt," Danny said. He looked up. His face was beginning to reassemble itself from shock back into the sharper configuration of someone who processes events as material. "Nora, that card, Meridian Group, I've been trying to run a story on them for 3 years. I had the story killed twice." He paused. "Once by my editor and once by someone above my editor who I was never able to identify." She looked at the card in her hand. She thought of her father's voice on the tape, the careful, controlled register giving way at the end to something much simpler. She thought of Helen's word tidy. She thought of the Geiger counter on the windowsill that had been measuring a contamination her family had been living inside of for 60 years without knowing it. She set the card on the table beside the ledger in the tape box. Outside, the barn was fully involved. There was nothing to save. The fire would burn to the foundation and then go out, and in the morning there would be a black rectangle of ash and twisted metal where 3 generations of equipment had been stored, and Sandra Pruitt's letter would still be on the table, and the bank's position would be unchanged. None of that was the primary problem anymore. "We need to move tonight," she said. "All of it, digitized and transmitted before morning." Danny was already opening his laptop. Ace lay down by the back door, the broken one, the one that no longer closed. He faced the dark yard and the glow of the dying fire, his ears moving in small, precise adjustments, reading the night. He would stay there until she told him to move. He always did. Part 3. The Canyon. The phone call came at 6:47 in the morning. Nora had not slept. She and Danny had worked through the night in the kitchen with the broken back door propped shut, with the heavy cast iron pot her mother had used for 30 years, and by 4 in the morning, every page of the ledger had been scanned. Every tape had been recorded at full quality, and the complete digital archive was sitting on 3 separate encrypted servers. The Journal's institutional server in Albuquerque, a cloud backup Danny managed personally, and a third location he described only as a journalist's insurance policy and declined to specify further. The physical originals were still on the table when the sky began to lighten. The warped leather ledger, the 3 reels in their cases, and Leland Cruz's laminated Meridian Group ID card with its broken lanyard clip. Danny had fallen asleep in the armchair with his laptop open on his knees sometime around 5. Nora had sat at the kitchen table and watched the gray light come up over the Sacramento mountains and thought about her father recording his voice into a machine in a room she hadn't known existed, knowing he might not live long enough to matter to the daughter he had just named. When the phone rang, she picked it up on the first tone. "Missy Hargrove?" Garrett's voice was the same as it had been on her porch, smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where losing your composure was the most expensive mistake available. "I hope the night wasn't too difficult." She said nothing. "We find ourselves in a position that neither of us particularly wanted," he continued. "You have materials that belong to a program under federal jurisdiction. We have someone who belongs to you." A pause calibrated to land at maximum weight. "Helen Marsh is a remarkably composed woman for her age. She sends her regards." Nora's hand tightened on the phone. She kept her voice flat. If she's been harmed, she's perfectly well. She'll remain perfectly well provided this conversation goes efficiently. His tone was that of a man discussing a logistics problem rather than a human life. The terms are simple. The original materials, the ledger, the tapes, and the item that Cruz inadvertently left behind last night, brought to Diablo Canyon by noon today. You come alone, no law enforcement, no additional vehicles, no communication devices beyond the phone you're using now, which you will leave in your truck. A pause. We exchange items for people, and everyone returns to their lives. The alternative scenario is considerably less organized. He gave her the coordinates and ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after the line went dead, her hand still on the receiver, her eyes moving to the window where the Geiger counter sat on the sill with its needle above zero in the early morning light. Then she woke Danny. The digitized files went out first. Danny transmitted the complete archive to his editor with a message that said, "Hold pending my signal. Do not open. Do not read. Do not acknowledge receipt to anyone." He sent a duplicate transmission to the journal's legal counsel with the same instruction. He was precise and fast in the way that people are fast when fear and professional training point in the same direction. While he worked, Nora went to the equipment shed and found the second military surplus ammunition she kept for storing spare parts identical in form to the one she intended to use, same model, same era, same olive drab paint. She filled it methodically with weight, a length of heavy logging chain, 3 rusted pipe fittings, 2 empty reel cases she found in her father's workshop, and a coil of old baling wire. She latched it and set it on the kitchen table beside the real one. The weight was close. The sound when you moved it was close. Then she took the real ammo can and loaded it carefully. The ledger went in first, wrapped in the plastic sheeting she used for moisture protection in the equipment barn. The 3 tape reels in their cases nested against the ledger. And last, Leland Cruz's Meridian Group ID card sealed in a small evidence bag Danny had in his kit. She latched the can and set the rubber seal. She carried it outside. The morning was cold and still the fire smell from the barn's ruins hanging in the air as a permanent note, the ash still warm at the center of the collapsed structure. Ace walked with her to the north pasture without being asked, ranging ahead, and then circling back, his movement covering the ground in the systematic pattern she recognized as his working mode. At the bulldozer, she climbed into the cab and moved the machine forward by 6 feet, exposing the packed earth it had been covering. She climbed down and knelt beside the steel frame of the hatch. She drove the entrenching tool into the hard earth sideways, not down, boring a horizontal cavity into the wall of the existing hole underneath the hatch's outer rim. The ground here was the same dense fossilized clay as everywhere near the mound, resistant, slow, requiring the kind of patient, sustained effort that eventually produces results regardless of what the material thinks about it. She dug until her arm went into the shoulder. The cavity was deep enough and positioned in a way that no surface inspection of the hatch or the surrounding ground would locate. It required knowing exactly where to look and why. She slid the ammo can in. She packed the earth back in layers, compressing each one with the heel of her hand and the flat of the entrenching tool until the surface was as hard as its surroundings. She scattered loose topsoil across the disturbed area. Then she drove the bulldozer forward again until the blade rested across the spot, 10 tons of cold steel sitting on the evidence like a lid. She sat in the cab for a moment, looking at the concrete sky above the mountains. Her father had been buried in secrets in this ground. She was burying the truth beside him, not to hide it permanently, but to protect it from the people who would destroy it and to keep it available for the moment when destroying it was no longer an option for them. An insurance policy Danny had called his server backup. This was a different kind of insurance, the physical kind, the kind that didn't require electricity or passwords or institutional goodwill to remain true. She climbed down. Ace was sitting at the base of the bulldozer's treads, looking up at her. His tail gave one slow, deliberate sweep. She went to the truck. She sat in the driver's seat with the decoy ammo can on the passenger floor and her hands on the steering wheel, and she did not start the engine. Her hands were shaking. Not badly, not visibly, probably to anyone watching from outside, but she could feel it in the small bones and the tendons of her fingers, where they gripped the wheel, a fine tremor that she recognized as the physical expression of a mind that was running its probability calculations and not entirely satisfied with the results. She was 52 years old with a bad left knee and PTSD that had been managed rather than resolved. She was walking into a position held by at least two trained operatives, possibly more, who had demonstrated they were willing to burn her property and assault people in her home. She was going in with a decoy and a plan that depended on precise timing and the cooperation of people she had met less than 12 hours ago. She had frozen last night. 1.5 seconds of Kandahar and Garrett had walked his man out the door she'd left open behind her. 1.5 seconds in the canyon could mean something different from 1.5 seconds in her kitchen. She dropped her head against the steering wheel. The familiar weight of the thought pressed down. You will freeze again. You have always frozen at the wrong moment. You were not enough in Afghanistan, and you were not enough last night. And Helen Marsh is in a canyon because you opened a hatch on a Tuesday morning thinking about water rights. The cold pressure came from the right. Ace had come through the open passenger window. She hadn't heard him, which was itself a kind of comment on his ability to move when he decided to, and he was pressing his head onto her hands on the steering wheel. Not a lean, not a nudge. The full, deliberate weight of his skull on her knuckles, warm and heavy, and absolutely present, the way a hand on a shoulder is more than a hand on a shoulder. She looked at him. He looked back with the amber eyes that had been reading her longer than anyone currently alive, and the expression in them was not pity or concern or the performance of comfort. It was simply, I see you. I am here. We are doing this. She sat with that for a moment. Then she lifted one hand from the wheel and put it on his head, her fingers finding the familiar shape of his ears, the place behind them where the short fur gave way to something softer. All right, she said. She started the engine. She dropped Danny at the base of the eastern ridge above Diablo Canyon with her binoculars and his camera, and the number for Captain Aldrich of the New Mexico State Police, whom she had called 40 minutes ago on Danny's phone with precise and carefully chosen language. Kidnapping in progress. Rogue defense contractors. Veteran under fire. Diablo Canyon. Wait for signal. Aldrich had the measured cadence of a man who had been in law enforcement long enough to believe unusual things when they were delivered in a specific tone of voice. He said he would position units at both canyon approaches and hold. If they move before you signal, the woman dies, Danny said. He was already pulling the camera from his bag, already moving toward the rock face. He stopped and looked at her. Nora. Go, she said. Film everything, whatever happens. He went. She drove the last 2 miles to the canyon floor alone, the decoy can on the passenger floor. Ace in the rear footwell, beneath the bench seat covered by the dark blanket she had folded there on her way out of the ranch. She had told him once, load up in the hole quiet until I call, and he had gone in and folded himself into the shadow and gone still. In 7 years, she had never given him a command he failed to execute. She was aware that this one carried somewhat higher stakes than most. Diablo Canyon was a geological scar, red rock walls rising 200 feet on either side of a flat sandy floor 100 yards wide. It ran roughly north to south, which meant that at mid-morning the sun was coming in at an angle that left the west wall in shadow and the east wall in hard light. She drove in from the north and stopped where Garrett had specified 200 feet from a cluster of boulders at the canyon's southern end. She could see them before she got out of the truck. Garrett stood to the left of the boulder cluster, his posture relaxed in the particular way of a trained man who is never fully relaxed. Beside him, sitting on a low flat rock, with her hands secured behind her back with what appeared to be zip ties, was Helen Marsh. Helen's white hair was slightly disordered, and her jacket had dust on the shoulder from what Nora assessed as being handled rather than harmed. Her face was pale but composed, and when she saw Nora's truck, she straightened her back with a deliberateness that communicated a complete rejection of the implicit suggestion that she was diminished by her circumstances. Leland Cruz was to the right, his right forearm wrapped in a field dressing that bulged under his jacket sleeve. His posture communicated a level of contained fury that Nora gauged as a tactical factor. A man in significant pain who is also angry makes errors. She filed this. She got out of the truck. She left the door open. She lifted the decoy can from the passenger floor and held it at her side. That's close enough, Garrett called. His voice carried cleanly in the canyon's acoustics. She stopped, 50 feet between them. She set the can down on the sandy floor in front of her. Let her go first, Nora said. Then I'll step back from the can. "We verify first," Garrett said. He nodded to Cruz. Cruz walked toward her, his good hand forward, his injured arm held slightly away from his body. His eyes were on her face with the specific attention of a man who has already been surprised once by a woman he underestimated and has revised his model, but not entirely resolved the resentment. He reached the can. He crouched, favoring his right arm, and worked the latch with his left hand. He opened the lid. He looked into the can for 2 full seconds. When his head came up, his face had the particular configuration of a man experiencing the compound sensation of being deceived and recognizing simultaneously that he has been outmaneuvered in a way he should have anticipated. He started. Nora put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled. The sound that followed happened in a sequence so compressed that the individual components were only distinguishable in reconstruction afterward. The rear passenger window of the truck, which she had lowered to its stop before leaving the ranch, filled briefly with the shape of 90 pounds of German Shepherd in full extensions, all 4 legs driving the white chest, leading the charcoal back level as a thrown spear. The dark blanket that had covered him spun away in his wake like something discarded. Ace crossed 30 feet of canyon floor in a time that did not seem consistent with the physics available to a domestic animal. He hit Leland Cruz in the chest. Cruz had been rising from his crouch and was at the worst possible angle when the impact arrived. Weight forward, center of gravity elevated the injured arm already compromised. He went backward and down with a sound that the canyon walls reflected back cleanly, and Nora was already moving. She had 20 feet on Garrett, and she had the advantage of his attention going to his partner for the half second that Ace's appearance required. Garrett was good. He was already turning back when she crossed the distance, but she had been moving on her signal rather than reacting to his, and the gap was enough. She did not try to strike him. She had learned a long time ago that striking a larger trained opponent was a transaction with unfavorable exchange rates. She went for the weapon hand, both of her hands on his wrist, driving it down and outward in the direction a wrist does not travel willingly, and she felt the joint give and heard the gun drop on the sandy floor before the pain registered on his face. He was strong. He recovered faster than she expected and got his other hand into the contest, and for several seconds they were locked in the specific, brutal arithmetic of 2 people who both know what they are doing and are competing for the same resource. She drove a knee into his thigh, not the target she wanted, but the target available, and used the moment of disrupted balance to take him into the rock face at the canyon's edge, the back of his head meeting stone with a sound that ended the arithmetic. He slid down the rock and sat. From above, from the eastern ridge, a sound she recognized as an exceptionally expensive camera shutter firing on continuous burst. And from both ends of the canyon, simultaneously, the sound she had been waiting for, the rising wail of sirens that the canyon walls gathered and amplified into something enormous. In the flash of lights that preceded 3 state police vehicles from the north and 2 from the south, all of them converging on the canyon floor, with the coordinated geometry of people who had been holding position and waiting for exactly this. Ace released Cruz when she called his name. He stepped back and stood with his chest still moving rapidly, his muzzle dark, his eyes on the man on the ground, with the patient attention of an animal that has completed a task and is monitoring for the need to resume it. Nora walked to Helen. She crouched in front of the older woman and worked the zip ties with the folding knife from her pocket. Helen's wrists were reddened but unbroken. When her hands came free, Helen placed them in her lap and looked at Nora with an expression that was partly relief and partly the slightly imperious composure of a woman who has decided that composure is the appropriate response to having been proven right about something she would have preferred to be wrong about. "Your dog," Helen said, "is extraordinary." "He really is," Nora said. Captain Aldrich was a tall man with a gray mustache and the unhurried efficiency of someone who had stopped being impressed by urgency early in his career. He processed the scene with the systematic attention of a professional directing his officers to secure Garrett and Cruz, while he spoke with Nora in the quiet voice of someone gathering a preliminary account. She gave him what he needed in the order he needed it, with the clean precision of 15 years of evidentiary reporting. Garrett sat against the canyon wall with his wrists wrapped, and his expression that of a man performing a calculation about what came next. He did not speak. He looked at Nora once, a long, flat look that communicated nothing she hadn't already understood about the situation. Cruz was louder. He was also horizontal, which limited his options. From the ridge above, Danny Marsh descended with his camera bag and his press credential and the particular energized focus of a journalist who has just filmed something that will require several days of continuous work to properly handle. What followed happened in the way these things happen, not cleanly, not completely, but in the incremental fashion of a process that produces partial results and calls them resolution. Garrett and Leland Cruz were charged and prosecuted. The charges were the ones that could be proved from Danny's footage and the physical evidence at the scene: kidnapping, aggravated assault, arson, criminal impersonation of federal officers. The charges were real and the sentences were real. Garrett received 11 years, Cruz 8. Project Nightfall was not mentioned in the courtroom. A federal motion filed on the second day of proceedings successfully excluded all reference to the bunker, the tapes, and Frank Hargrove on the grounds of an ongoing federal investigation of a sensitive national security nature. The judge, a careful man with a careful reputation, accepted the motion without apparent discomfort. Meridian Group issued a statement of 4 sentences, disavowing the actions of 2 individuals acting outside their authorized scope of employment and expressing commitment to full cooperation with relevant authorities. The statement was released on a Friday afternoon, the traditional burial time for information, and the company retreated behind a wall of legal representation that showed no signs of structural weakness. Sandra Pruitt called Nora 10 days after the arrests. Her voice carried the specific quality of a person delivering a message they have been told to deliver and are relieved to be delivering. The bank was suspending all foreclosure proceedings on the Hargrove property pending review of extraordinary circumstances. A loan restructuring offer would be forthcoming. She hoped Nora was recovering well. A GoFundMe campaign Danny had started framed around the barnfire, the service dog, and the phrase "a veteran's fight for her land and her father's truth" raised enough in 72 hours to rebuild the barn and cover 4 months of operating expenses with a margin remaining. Helen Marsh appeared twice on regional television news programs, declined on all further media requests, and used the attention her name briefly carried to successfully lobby the county commissioners for a library budget increase that had been stalled for 6 years. The federal investigation produced 8 weeks later a press conference. Nora watched it at the kitchen table with Danny sitting across from her, an ace at her feet, and the Geiger counter still on the windowsill where she had decided it would stay. The spokesperson was a woman named Patricia Vance from the Department of Energy, young, and composed with the practiced sincerity of someone who had been trained to deliver difficult information in a way that produced the sensation of transparency without its substance. The department, Patricia Vance said, had completed a preliminary review of the recently identified historical site in Otero County, New Mexico. The site was associated with a legacy Cold War-era experimental program that had been inadequately documented and improperly decommissioned due to administrative failures consistent with the record-keeping practices of the period. The department was committed to full remediation of any environmental concerns identified at the site. A comprehensive public report would be made available following the completion of the ongoing investigation, the timeline for which could not be specified due to the complexity of the historical record. The words containment and seismic and strontium and aquifer and Frank Hargrove did not appear in any form. Danny set his coffee cup down harder than he intended. They're going to run out the clock. The report will be classified as soon as no one is looking. Yes, Nora said. We have the digital archive. We can publish what we have, and they will call the tapes unverified, and the ledger a fabrication, and cite a grieving daughter's motivated interpretation of ambiguous historical materials. She looked at him. You know this is true. He did. He looked at his hands. The originals are the answer, he said. The physical materials, the tape magnetic signatures, the paper aging, the ink composition, the biological material on the ID card. That's forensic evidence that can't be argued into ambiguity. Yes, Nora said again. He looked at her with the expression of a reporter arriving at the edge of a story whose final chapter has not been written yet. And the originals are safe, she said, for now, for as long as they need to be. He understood then that she was not going to tell him where. He sat with this for a moment and then, to his credit, nodded once and accepted it as the correct answer to a question that had no better one available. The government crew arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the arrests. They were efficient and impersonal, a team of 8 in matching gray work gear with DOE contractor credentials, and a flatbed truck carrying materials that included, among other things, 2 pallets of pre-mixed concrete and a heavy steel form for a containment slab. They worked for 3 days. They took soil samples. They documented the surrounding area, and the interior of the bunker through the hatch opening. They pumped a chemical sealant into the tunnel entrance and allowed it to cure. They removed the bulldozer from the area and replaced it when they were done. On the 3rd day, they poured the slab. It was 2 feet thick, and it covered the hatch, completely extending 8 feet in every direction from its edges. When it cured, it was perfectly white in the high desert sun, smooth and hard and permanent. Stamped into its surface at the center before the concrete set were the words, "United States Government, do not tamper." Nora watched the crew work from the fence line of the north pasture on the 1st day and did not return until they had gone. She stood in front of the slab on a morning in late autumn when the air had finally turned and the Sacramento mountains had their first dusting of snow on the upper ridges, small and white against the blue sky, like something beginning rather than ending. The ranch behind her was quieter than it had been. The new barn framing was up. She could hear the faint sound of nail guns from the contractors. Danny's fundraiser had paid for 3 men working their way up the roof structure with a steady rhythm. The 60 cattle were in their pens. The feed trough was full. Sandra Pruitt's restructured loan agreement was in a folder on the kitchen table, signed and returned. She stood in front of the white concrete slab and looked at the government's words pressed into it and thought about the men who had poured it and what they believed they had accomplished. She thought about Patricia Vance and her careful language and the filing cabinet somewhere in Washington, where Frank Hargrove's truth would sit in a sealed folder, accumulating the particular kind of dust that falls on things that have been decided against. She thought about her father in a room very much like the one below her, recording his voice into a machine he owned, knowing what he knew, accepting what he could not change, and still bothering to say clearly and specifically what was true. She looked down. The white slab ended at a clean edge. 18 inches beyond that edge was ordinary ground, packed pale indistinguishable from the 10,000 square feet of identical high desert hardpack that surrounded it. The slab ended at its design perimeter. The ammo can was 14 inches beyond that edge and 42 inches below the surface in the cavity she had cut sideways under the hatch's outer rim in the earth that the government survey had designated as outside the contamination exclusion zone and had not sampled and had not disturbed and had not thought to look at because no one who poured the slab had any reason to believe there was anything beside it worth finding. The ledger was there. The tapes were there. Leland Cruz's Meridian Group ID card was there with his DNA still on the lanyard surface. The slab said, "Do not tamper." The earth beside it said nothing. Earth didn't. Ace sat beside her, his shoulder against her thigh, his ears moving in their small, precise adjustments, reading the wind from the mountains, the way he read everything patiently, completely, without urgency. She put her hand on his head. The thick fur was warm from the thin autumn sun. She was 52 years old, and she had grown up without a father, and she had never heard his voice until 3 weeks ago, and she had not managed to put the people who killed him in a room that acknowledged the crime. The system had processed what it could see and protected what it couldn't afford to acknowledge and produced the results that systems reliably produce when the thing being examined is their own history. She knew all of this. She also knew that her father had been a careful man, a methodical man, a man who checked his work twice and then checked it again, who made copies and stored them off-site, who recorded his voice into a machine and hid the evidence in the earth because he understood that the truth needed to survive the people who wanted it gone. She understood him finally. Not from the photograph on her mother's dresser or from the second-hand account of a woman in a library, but from the inside, from the bone knowledge of having done the same thing for the same reason in the same ground. She was Frank Hargrove's daughter. The evidence was in the earth. The digital archive was on 3 servers. Danny Marsh was writing a story that would be ready the moment the official report tried to close the door permanently. And the Geiger counter on her kitchen windowsill was still ticking soft and stouty, measuring the thing that had been measured and ignored for 60 years, and it would keep ticking for as long as she decided it needed to. She didn't win. She knew that. The people who had ordered her father's death were protected by time and institutional memory in the specific invulnerability of an entity large enough to absorb scandals by reclassifying them. She had not avenged Frank Hargrove. She had not corrected 60 years of buried contamination or resurrected the name of a careful man from the file where it had been interred. But she had found him. She had heard his voice. She had followed his reasoning across half a century and arrived at the same conclusion by the same method, and the conclusion was still true, and the evidence was still in the earth, and the earth was still hers. She turned away from the slab. The mountains were clear to the north, the snow on the upper ridges catching the morning light and holding it. The new barn frame made a clean geometry against the sky. The cattle moved in the pens with the slow, purposeful movement of animals that have been fed and are content. "Come on, Ace," she said. He fell into step beside her without breaking from his watch, turning when she turned, moving when she moved, as he had always done. They walked back toward the house together, the woman and her dog, across the hard, pale earth of the Hargrove Ranch, and the north pasture was quiet behind them, and the white slab caught the morning sun, and 14 inches from its edge. The truth waited in the dark with the patience of something that has already outlasted the people who buried it once, and is entirely prepared to outlast them again.